Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, all of you. I know we have people joining us from many different parts of the world. My name is Anu Gupta, and I'm the Assistant Dean for International Academic Support at Rutgers Global. So on behalf of Rutgers Global and our Vice President, Dr. Rick Garfunkel, I welcome you to this very important conversation today about COVID-19 and its worldwide consequences on women. Today, we are going to be looking at three impact areas. We are going to be looking at sexual and reproductive health and rights, labor, and violence against women and girls. The sessions are going to be moderated by Rutgers' own Dr. Yana Rogers, who is the faculty director of the Center for Women in Work, and Dr. Rebecca Mark, who is the director of the Institute of Women's Leadership. We request the audience to please keep your audio and video off at all times, but we really do hope that you will engage. There is going to be a Q&A after each impact area, and we hope that at that time we can address all your questions and comments. There's also going to be some time at the end. And please include your name and your affiliation so that we may acknowledge you. So let's start the program. I actually remember attending the World Conference on Women in 1995. At this conference, governments from around the world agreed on a comprehensive plan to achieve global legal equity. And this is a document that's referred to commonly as the Beijing Platform for Action. The year 2020 marked its 25th anniversary. With the spread of COVID-19, the modest gains that have been made over the past decades are at the risk of getting lost, as can be seen in this video that was prepared for the Generation Equality Forum, a global movement for gender equality convened by UN Women. Let's watch.
While we waited, a woman was locked down with her abuser. While we waited, a girl was forced out of school.
While we waited, a mother fed her children, not herself.
In the year the world stopped,
women's rights were reversed, undoing years of progress. Just like that.
As the world begins to turn again,
we must begin to act.
For the 1 in 3 women who have experienced violence in their lifetime.
For the 47 million more women being pushed into extreme poverty because of the pandemic.
For the 50% of the population
who deserve 50% of the power.
This year, leaders and changemakers will meet at the Generation Equality Forum.
A forum to build up and strengthen women's rights for generations to come.
Let's show that we're standing up
so equality can step forward. And in a year where it's virtually impossible to meet, we'll meet virtually.
Don't wait. It's time to act for equal.
Anu, you're muted.
Thank you. I now invite our first distinguished speaker, Ms. Laura Turkay, who is the policy advisor at UN Women, where she leads the organization's flagship report, Progress of the World's Women. For the past decade, she has worked for UN Women, leading major research and data initiatives that inform the organization's advocacy objectives. She is the co-founder of the UN Feminist Network and previously worked at various NGOs. Thank you, Laura, for joining us and for providing a global overview.
Okay, I hope you can see that and can hear me well. So thank you so much, Anu, for that introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today. As Anu said, I'm going to talk a bit about the work that UN Women's been doing over the past year on the impact of the COVID crisis on gender equality. I'm going to talk a little bit about the policy response that we've seen so far, and then also give you a small preview into a project that we're launching in June ahead of the Generation Equality Forum called A Feminist Plan for Sustainability and Social Justice, which aims to lay out an agenda for building back better after the crisis in ways that can promote gender equality. So just first, and I know that this is in terms of the impacts of COVID, this is something that the other speakers are going to go into a tremendous amount of depth on. So I will just give a kind of snapshot of so just a snapshot of the global picture. So we know that men have been more affected by the worst direct impacts of the worst direct health impacts of COVID-19. But we also know that women have been hit very hard by the economic and social fallout. Feminists have argued for years, for decades, that there's no such thing as a gender-neutral crisis. And indeed, in this case, women have been disproportionately affected in the sense that they are 70% of frontline health workers globally, as victims of domestic abuse, often forced to shelter in place with their abusers, as unpaid caregivers, as a lot of the unpaid care work or care work has been pushed back into homes in the context of schools and childcare being shut. As workers in precarious jobs, we know that women are overrepresented in the informal economy, in jobs that are usually unprotected by social protection or basic labor rights. And in 2020, globally, 64 million women became economically inactive. So not in a job, but not even looking for a job. And all of these gendered impacts are anticipated to drive 47 million more women into extreme poverty in 2021, according to the data analysis, the data projections that UN Women has done. So in this context of these particularly kind of harsh gendered impacts of the crisis, what are governments doing to respond? Well, we wanted to find out more about that. And so we teamed up with UNDP to put together the COVID-19 Global Gender Response Tracker. So you're seeing the homepage, the dashboard that we put together with UNDP. And basically what we wanted to do was to monitor the policy measures enacted by national governments and look at what proportion of them are gender sensitive, which ones respond to women's particular needs and the particular impacts that they are facing. And we also looked, as well as at different policy areas, we also looked at the extent to which women are represented in some of the COVID task forces that have been set up by governments. So this dashboard that you're seeing here, it contains over 3,100 measures from all countries in the world. And we looked at four policy areas: on violence against women, on fiscal policies, labour market policies, and social protection. And the dashboard, I'll post the link in the chat later, but the dashboard enables you to search by country, by region, or by type of measure. And it also gives you, the database also provides information on the content of the policy. So it's kind of some quite interesting qualitative analysis possible as well. So looking, so a quick snapshot of the results, what we found. First of all, on women's representation on task forces. Now, I think, as everyone knows, in the context of the crisis, governments have often put in place emergency decision-making bodies, which have been responsible for rolling out the policy response. So we felt it was really important to know who is on these bodies and how representative they are. What we found was that overall 24% of task force members are women. But only 4%, which is actually similar to the proportion of women's representation in parliaments, interestingly. But only 4% of task forces have achieved gender parity, and 84% of task forces are male dominated. It's interesting also to look at where women are in these task forces. So we found that they were better represented in those task forces that have an advisory function versus decision-making authority. And that women tend to be better represented in public health task forces compared to economic and multi-sectoral task forces. So obviously the fact that women are better represented on the public health task forces is a good thing. But given that women are 70% of healthcare workers globally, that they're still highly underrepresented by that standard. So then in terms of the policies, we looked at, as I said, we looked at sort of three big issues for women in the context of the crisis. So violence against women, economic security, and unpaid care. And overall, we found that 187 governments have taken gender-sensitive measures, and 2/3 of those respond to violence against women. We saw many fewer measures on economic security or unpaid care. So on violence, the response, I guess, is heartening. 2/3 of governments have taken action. And this is, can be seen in part as a response to the UN Secretary General's call to action to respond to what he described as a horrifying surge in violence against women and what's been called the so-called shadow pandemic. So we found 832 measures across 149 countries on violence against women, and many of these were about strengthening services for survivors, things like helplines, reporting mechanisms, and so on. But although this is good, we see a lot of positive measures. It was also important to note that only 52 countries have integrated violence against women into their COVID-19 national plans. And I think many of the measures that we see, though important, are quite small scale given the extent of the problem. So a helpline here, sort of a public campaign there, important stuff. But when you think about the scale of the issue, not always reaching matching that scale. And then when we look at the response in terms of economic policies, it's been much more muted. So we found 1,700 social protection and labour market measures, and only 13% of those target women's economic security, and only 11% support unpaid care. So the kinds of measures that we saw in relation to women's economic security are cash transfers and in-kind support, mostly food, that prioritise women as recipients. And the ones that we found were often short-term, but there are some examples of more generous and longer-term policies as well. Something that we worried about a bit was that few countries seem to be targeting policies at women's re-entry into the workforce as economies are beginning to unlock. Some are doing that. Because we know that not only have women lost jobs at a disproportionate rate, but after crises, it tends to be more difficult for women to re-enter the workforce. And then on unpaid care, we saw family and paid sick leave, care for dependents, cash for care to compensate for school and daycare closures, and childcare services, especially for essential workers. But the measures on unpaid care were pretty few and far between. So I've talked a bit about the impact of COVID on gender equality and women's rights, and also the immediate policy response. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about, what next? I mean, obviously the pandemic is still raging. The images we're getting from India and Brazil and other countries make it very, very clear that we're still absolutely in the thick of this appalling tragedy. But I think there has also been attention to, the possibility of, once we're through this or, through the worst, what are the prospects for building back better? What are the prospects for recovery? And even before COVID-19, the global economy was in quite a fragile state, not really fully recovered from the last big crisis, the global financial crisis, with sluggish growth and growing inequalities, rising intolerance, nationalism, and backlash against women's rights. And while the global fiscal response aimed at mitigating the economic fallout of the crisis has been unprecedented in many ways, it has also been largely concentrated in high-income countries. And already we know that countries in the global south are being pressured to implement austerity measures, which we know have a hugely damaging impact on women. The other aspect of this is that there's another crisis that's coming fast down the track. It's with us in many parts of the world already, which is the crisis of environmental degradation and climate change. So in many ways, we're at a crossroads. And I think that the question for the global community is, are we going to sort of double down on the past mistakes of the past, or are we going to use this crisis as a wake-up call to do things differently? So against this context, UN Women is working on a feminist plan for sustainability and social justice, which aims to influence the creation of a more equal and sustainable post-COVID world by bringing together a visionary agenda, but also a set of concrete steps that will help us get there. We're going to bring this forward in the context of the Generation Equality Forum that's coming up in June. So just very briefly, with the last few minutes I have, I just wanted to tell you a little bit more about the kind of main planks of that agenda. So it's about creating an economy that centers care for people and planet, centering this idea of, asking what the economy is for, and if it's for creating, enabling the survival and flourishing of life, what are the kinds of policies that we need to get there? So we've identified three sort of key policy areas about creating a caring economy, valuing and supporting the work that we've now come to recognize as essential, generating sustainable livelihoods, moving workers from the informal economy to the formal economy through building gender responsive social protection frameworks, which can, creates greater resilience for, the next crisis. And then, ensuring that the transition that we need to now make to greener economies, more environmental sustainability is done in a way that is, centers gender equality and is gender just. And I think in terms of the enablers of how we get there, this is an ambitious agenda. We're highlighting the critical importance of macroeconomic policies that are aligned with these social environmental goals and the need for, feminist leadership for progressive policy change. So that's the feminist plan that we're going to launch in June. And I will stop there and very much look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. This is a fantastic global overview, and I think you've set us up so nicely for the next three discussions. And for the audience, we will have a chance to ask Laura questions as well after the first impact area. So with that, I'm going to give it to Dr. Rogers, the Faculty Director for Center for Women in Work, who will be moderating the next session, which is the COVID-19 impact on the sexual and reproductive health and rights of women. Dr. Rogers.
Thank you very much, Anu. It is really my distinct pleasure to recommend to introduce two speakers who are just fantastic. I've met them both in person and seen them in action in their advocacy and their leadership roles. First, we have Giselle Carino, who is the CEO of International Planned Parenthood Federation in the Western Hemisphere region. She's a progressive feminist herself, and the organization, of course, a progressive feminist ecosystem of 26 and growing local partner organizations, mostly from the Global South, who share a common mission to ensure universal access to sexual and reproductive health care, eliminate violence against women, girls, and gender diverse people, provide sex education, and fight for sexual and reproductive justice by dismantling structural sexism, racism, and other forms of oppression. We also have with us today Bern Roos-Snyder, a trained lawyer who is the Director of Public Policy at Change in Washington, D.C., the Center for Health and Gender Equity. She oversees the organization's policy priorities and strategies for promoting sexual and reproductive health and rights within U.S. foreign assistance. Bern earlier has worked as the managing attorney of the Center for HIV Law and Policy, and she also worked as counsel for Chicago's 2016 Olympic bid. Not only is she an advocate and a lawyer, she's also a writer and scholar, and she's written on, most recently, the Global Gag Rule, Women in HIV, and broadening access to essential medicines. So without further ado, I will turn the floor over to Giselle.
Good, excellent. You never know if it's going to work. You practice, and at the last minute it may not work. So it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation to be part. I wanted to talk about, and it's a pleasure to follow Laura as well. Thank you so much for the presentation and also for the data, who has been instrumental for us, feminist activists and organizations on the ground. A year ago, we had all of our programs close, our clinics close, and most of the work had stopped by March of last year. We had the sad privilege of, in Latin America and the Caribbean, being one of the first regions hit very badly by the pandemic. And since then, we have had starts and stop, constant start and stop. When we think, for those of us who are in the US and have maybe access, one dose of the vaccine or two, and begin to think that there may be a different moment for us. That's not the situation that, as you know, is shared across the world. And I just wanted to recognize that as both as a privilege and also to highlight how that will continue to affect most of the countries in which we work for the years to come. As I think Jana mentioned, I'm from Argentina. We do have had before the pandemic a lot of conversation about the care economy. And so I look forward to learning more about the advances that the pandemic forced us to do in this area. As I said, when COVID-19 began for us, many of us in the feminist movement and from IPPF WHR, what we began doing was to call on governments to really ensure gender-sensitive responses to the pandemic. We partner with Amnesty International, with Women's Link Worldwide, and release a set of guidelines for that purpose, to help governments grapple and understand what a gender response was. And we deeply, through our prior experience, knew exactly what was coming. The gender lens in emergencies is not news. It's not news in preparedness. It's not news in response. You name the emergency. The last one I thought, as I was thinking about this, was the Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, where the same patterns repeat. And no matter how many of us have fought hard to be part of the preparedness committees, to make sure we are part of the national plans of response, all of a sudden, women and girls and sexual and reproductive health needs do not take a priority. And this is exactly what we saw as the COVID pandemic set in. We have also seen, thinking of the Ebola crisis or the Zika pandemic in Brazil, all these parallels. We knew that lack of access to SRHR increased maternal mortality, but 75% in Guinea and Liberia and Sierra Leone. We knew that the lack, the Zika epidemic, we stopped talking about Zika, but we know in Brazil about 900 babies were born last year with the Zika syndrome. And we felt and have assessed that because the Brazilian government, in this case, has done nothing to improve access to sexual and reproductive health care, to social protection, to safer water and sanitation for Black and Indigenous and poor rural women, they are the most affected, right? We also follow very closely the work of our colleagues at UNFPA, who released 2 reports, one in August last year and one later on, I think earlier this year, where basically about 40 years, I'm 44, about 40 years worth of progress in women's rights in Latin America and the Caribbean has been erased in the year of the pandemic, right? Which means concretely that about the latest data show that between 9 and 20 million women in Latin America will be affected by lack of contraceptives. And if measures are not taken to remedy this problem, we could have 1.7 million unwanted pregnancies, about 800,000 abortions, maternal death, infant death, and the list go on, no? So I think the pandemic really has exposed how essential care, in the economy has to do with our collective survival and how dependent we are on who is going to cook, clean, sell us food, care for our children, care for us when we are sick. And I think we believe that the patriarchy as a system of oppression hides all of this and naturalize all of this care as life as it is, as it always will be, and therefore makes this invisible, right? And we therefore believe there is no way to fight this pandemic other than with a very feminist approach to it. So as I mentioned, when our programs were closed and there wasn't, we were not sure what to do next, right? Because I don't know if you're familiar, but many of the lockdowns in Latin America and the Caribbean not only have been the longest I come from Argentina. Our lockdown has been the longest ever. Many of them are not really evidence-based and highly gendered. We had a number of countries where women and men cannot go out in the same day. And that has huge implications, as you can imagine, not only for accessing care, for regular life, and exposes particularly the people we center our efforts on to police and police discretion as it comes to enforcing the lockdowns. And so what we did, we developed, we developed a methodology. We work with the Princeton Latin American Lab, trying to assess, the needs of the vulnerable communities. For us, those are really Black and brown women, indigenous women, women on the move. I sometimes call them refugees, but it's a broad term and as you know, we are experiencing a huge crisis of women on the move out of Venezuela to many of the Latin American countries, and began to look at some of the dimensions of reproductive justice and how a country's service provision in terms of sexual and reproductive health is distributed. As you know, as happens here as well, rural women have much harder access to services. And we applied that methodology. We estimated that about 600,000 women had actually not received the care they needed in our network alone, which you can imagine, and this covers 15 countries, so about half of the countries we work in. So the impact is huge. It's not just in the numbers, it's in the everyday work we see it. And so we develop a quick response package with quick relief grants for organizations to go where women are, in their homes. And not surprisingly, that's exactly what they did. We call this creative resilience, and it's the ability of the organizations and frontline workers. Not surprisingly, when you look at our network, out of 10 healthcare providers, frontliners, 8 are women. So the response was exactly that. We looked to serve, and I just have the example here of CSR organization in Bolivia, working with a huge indigenous population. They develop low-tech WhatsApp contact, telephone hotlines to really bring services to women. They develop home-based care. And, as we here deliver food, they deliver contraceptives, period. That was a very low-tech, quick solution that, as we have the ability to transit even in the context of the lockdown, because we are healthcare providers, we could do that and try to do that. And our partners as well in Brazil and Chile began developing networks so women could access really through telemedicine and virtual platforms, abortion care, which was one of the cares that, as you can imagine, suffered the most, already in a region with huge restrictions for abortion care. So I just wanted to conclude by saying that, most unfortunately, it's just a matter of time before the next emergency hits us, and we are not over this, and we are likely to take many years to recover of this. We feel that both, governments and civil society really need to learn from these experiences and be better prepared to address SRHR for women, girls, and gender diverse population. No matter how or the specifics of the emergency, really, women and girls care needs to be a foundational concept of the response, and we believe that we need to take some of these creative resilience to scale. We need to create these solutions and invest much more in community-based and women-to-women care, as it's the most reliable way for SRHR needs to be accessed. So thank you very much. I'm very happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Giselle. That was such important information to have. And we all know that we need to have data like that in order to push for the policies that will protect vulnerable individuals, especially women. Let me see, I think we're going to go straight to Bern for your presentation, and then we will do 10 minutes of Q&A after Bern is finished. So Bern, I believe you Do you have a PowerPoint to share?
No slides. It means I don't have to awkwardly try to figure out how to screen share. So
okay, we will just.
I'm not good at it. Thank you so much. And I'm going to just build briefly on what Giselle and Laura have already shared and talk about a couple different pieces of impact on sexual and reproductive health and rights globally due to and during the COVID epidemic. And as others have said, I want to be clear that we're not through it, not through the pandemic, not through the impacts, and particularly the sort of service and policy impacts. Many children are still at home right now. None of this stuff is in past tense. Many things are still virtual. India's in the global headlines, but a lot of other countries should be as well. So too soon to use past tense for any of this. It's more some themes that have been gleaned over the last 14, 15 months. Because the pandemic is global, it's really tempting to universalize. But policy is national and local. So the experiences of women and girls in accessing their sexual and reproductive health care and in protecting their sexual and reproductive rights vary wildly and radically throughout the world during COVID. I'm going to talk about a few of the themes, but the impact is not equal. And of course, it's not separate from the existing neo-colonial, donor-driven, racist, homophobic, and anti-feminist systems and policies that existed before the pandemic. So the pandemic is coming down on top of many things that already made sexual and reproductive health and rights hard to access and very unequal. So the two things I'm going to really just chat about is integration and the real impact, disparate impact of COVID on the integration of services. This has been a major push in sexual and reproductive health care over the last 20 years to co-locate services, to create services that are more driven by what women and girls and other people getting services are asking for in ways and times that are more accessible. And what we've seen is a pretty serious disintegration of services. So perhaps you can pick up your 3 months of antiretrovirals, which has been a really positive part of COVID, is that we've moved to longer prescriptions for HIV medications in many places in the world. So you only have to go pick them up once every 3 months. That's wonderful. But in a lot of those places, family planning, which you might have been able to get at the same stop before, you're not able to get your family planning in 3-month increments in the same way. So your choices are sort of, come get your HIV meds, but nothing else, or sort of fight to try to go to multiple appointments, which pretty universally is something that people don't enjoy in their health services, is having to do multiple visits for something that might have been integrated before. You might be able to pick up loads of condoms in drop-off sites. That's one of the HIV prevention and contraceptive methods that was still mostly available. There were stockouts due to supply chain because of COVID. We had real service. We had contraceptive access issues that weren't just about people getting to the services, but also about commodities, and commodities getting impacted, especially early in the pandemic last spring and early summer. So even when we got the supply chain back up for condoms, you might be able to go and get them in bulk so that you don't have to go into clinic multiple times, but you might not be getting the gender-based violence screenings or the information that you would have been getting before. So this pulling apart of what has been long fought to be put together into more single visits is something that has suffered enormously. Youth-friendly services, which often rely on social interactions, peer groups, relationship buildings, have been incredibly hard hit. My colleagues at Rutgers in the Netherlands have done some recent reporting about access to SRHR services for young people, and pretty much globally, they've suffered enormously. The lockdowns in particular, it's even harder for young people to get out of the house and get to the services that are intended to be for them. And a lot of those are the first cut or the first stalled by governments or by clinicians. And then, the classic challenge with integration, when we create this emergency, when there's an emergency with the pandemic, as Giselle said, we know SRHR is always deprioritized. It's always a fight to get it included in any kind of humanitarian response, any kind of emergency. And in this case, we had an emergency come in and supersede so many sexual and reproductive health services. And so the prioritizing of certain health interventions at a clinical level, not even a policy level, really officially and unofficially deprioritized sexual and reproductive health and rights. You have to fight for them hard to remain even in good times. And they were treated as non-essential across many countries and many contexts. And I'll talk about that in the policy context now. So the other sort of overarching place that we've seen major sexual and reproductive health and rights repercussions during COVID has been in policy. So, as with many emergencies, it has emboldened anti-gender and anti-SRHR governments around the world. We saw here in the United States a real push last spring as lockdowns were rolling out. Conservative state governments moved very quickly and hard to limit abortion as part of their responses to the COVID. And they did that through getting it sort of defined as a non-essential medical service. So all abortions would be canceled or deferred, telling providers they couldn't provide them during COVID. And that is, that is not medically sound. It was a real opportunity for conservative governments to pounce and do something they'd long been pushing, which is trying to define abortion as non-essential and not necessarily a health service. And that's something we saw very clearly in some of these state governments in the United States, but we saw it worldwide with governments that already had an anti-SRHR view, really using this as an opportunity to further restrict or marginalize, especially abortion provision, but also other sexual and reproductive health care services. This opportunity of basically treating a state of emergency as a chance to curtail fundamental human rights. And that we see well beyond sexual and reproductive health and rights, but we saw a lot of emergency declarations that looked to function as a cover for repressive actions, both on sexual and reproductive health and rights, but oftentimes across the board on civil society, on government transparency, on all the things that create the sort of, I don't know, the pool water that sexual and reproductive health and rights work within. And that really requires good government transparency, good information and data gathering abilities, and good civil society engagement. And a lot of governments sort of used the state of emergency as the opportunity to do those things that they had been looking for. There have been some really positive moments and movements. Even in the United States, we obviously have a really radical transition in leadership in the middle of the COVID response, and other countries have as well. But, we did even back last year, there was a good U.S. Senate resolution on recognizing the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on women and girls globally that recognized many of the pieces that we're talking about today. You did see governments really start to actually provide and allow for medical abortion in a new way because of the COVID pandemic. Governments that had been more restrictive and in how they allowed the provision. There are some governments that went the other way. And we even saw this in the last 2 weeks, where we now have a Biden administration in the United States who is removing the restrictions on mailing abortion pills on MIFI during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we'll have to see how that extends or doesn't beyond the public health emergency that is COVID-19, but it is a really positive movement towards more accessibility and availability for medication abortion. And then just finally, in the policy landscape, one of the huge challenges of COVID-19 has been, it has really upended the movements and the momentum. There are a number of countries that were really working on proactive policy, or were beating back serious anti-gender, anti-SRHR bills, whether it was in Parliament or through other sort of administrative ways. And the pandemic has really changed that momentum and made it reprioritized for all of us. Energy that was being spent on proactive legislation, or in the cases of my colleagues in countries that are really restrictive environments, even just trying to beat back new terrible bills. So much of that energy has now had to go into COVID-19 at a policy level, at a parliament level, and at a personal level, whether it's caretaking for their own families and having energy taken out of the movement. For me, my ability to continue to do the same level of work is really impacted when I'm homeschooling 2 children. And that has been true sort of across the world in many, many different ways. That has policy movement is oftentimes very, very slow, and thinking about the way all of the energy on sexual and reproductive health and rights, so much of it has had to go into pandemic response, or dealing with these governments that are using it as an anti-gender opportunity. Is a huge challenge, and one that we're certainly not out of the woods on yet. So I think I'll leave it there for now.
Great, thank you so much for your excellent remarks based on your experience and your advocacy at Change. So informative, and I like what you said about there are some positive aspects to this, but so much concern also, and so much need for more action on getting women these services that they need. We do have time for Q&A. I know, Giselle, you have to leave soon for another meeting, and your colleague, Luna Pereira, will be taking over for you, but are there any questions from the participants here? I know I could ask a couple myself, but I don't see any in the chat, and I don't see any hands up. Perhaps if you want to unmute yourself, if you have a question for either one of our speakers. Maybe I'll start with mine, and then if there's a question, if you want to put it in the chat or use your hand signal. But I know Giselle and Byrne, you've both done work as well on the Global Gag Rule, and maybe one of you can briefly summarize for the uninformed what the Global Gag Rule is, and if you've seen any relief with the new administration since the Global Gag Rule has been rescinded, or if the effects of COVID-19 on access to contraception has just been so overwhelmingly large that it made no difference that the Global Gag Rule was rescinded. So what has been the overlap of that? Maybe Giselle, if you want to start, and then
yeah. I think Björn can probably start on the global gag rule. I would say that everything makes a difference. Even in the middle of a pandemic, we managed to create a law reform in Argentina that made abortion safe and legal up to 14 weeks. So I just wanted to, because I realized that when we talk about this, the panorama is so bleak, it's so difficult to grapple with the level of challenges that we have ahead and we will have ahead for the next years. But I did want to mention that the feminist movements are more active than ever. We have not stopped fighting in the streets in the middle of the pandemic, in the social networks, and we are not going to back down until sexual and reproductive health and rights are available to women, girls, and gender diverse people everywhere. So I just wanted to say that, and the expert on the global gag rule is really Björn, so she should speak about that.
Well, you have a lot to say on that too, Giselle, but the global gag rule is a US policy that is put in place by a president and removed by a president that restricts what someone receiving US global health assistance can do with any other money. And I think as many people know, the US is the largest global health donor in the world. And so it's essentially a poison pill that a foreign organization receiving any global health money from the US, it poisons their whole organization and makes it so they can't perform, provide, promote abortion as a method of family planning. That includes information, it includes referrals, it includes counseling. And under Trump, it also meant anyone who got any funding from you as the organization, it also gagged them. So the poison went down. So it impacted other donors' funds in a way that it hasn't before. It was removed on January 28th by President Biden, along with an affirmative statement, the first we've ever received from a US government, that it is the policy of the US government and this administration to support the sexual and reproductive health and rights of women and girls globally and domestically. So that is a sea change. And what I will say in terms of where that overlaps with COVID, I actually see there being a real positive, which I think is because of COVID, our systems of communication are stronger than they've been before. So the ability of the news and what it meant to spread to organizations and individuals and clinicians around the world, I think is better than it would have been a year before. And that's not a small thing, because the removal has oftentimes been excruciatingly slow, and it comes from USAID, and it's changed contract language, and all of that is still true. But I do think we had a lot more energy towards making its removal mean something quickly. And we're able to overcome some of the previous barriers because of it. That's the cheeriest answer I can give.
Yana, can I add something to this? I want to acknowledge here our partners from Colombia and Honduras. Both of them have been under the global gag rule for many years and fought very hard providing care. One thing that I think is important is that the rule prohibits you from using your own funding to do so. And so it's terrible on so many levels. And like Björn, I think we are tired of waiting. We want this to mean something concretely to us, and we don't have 4 years to wait for this to be, for the government to embrace a really US feminist foreign policy that creates long-lasting change for women and girls around the world. And we rely on partners like Change to keep those fights for us in Washington. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you. I still don't see any questions in the chat or see any hands raised, so maybe I'll squeeze in one more question for you, Giselle, before you need to go. You mentioned women on the move, especially out of Venezuela, and you recently featured, you sent me a New York Times article that featured the work of one of your partners in Venezuela and all of the the centers there having to close down, women not having access to contraception. What do you think is going to happen in Venezuela? Are things even going to get worse before they get better? What is your prognosis for that country in particular?
I consider myself to be a very optimistic person, and I cannot see anything good happening in Venezuela anytime soon. I think things will get worse. We have 5 clinics. We have a partner with 5 clinics across the country. And they're also setting up a clinic on the Colombian side of the border, as the letters we receive of women on the move, trying to access all type of care, are really heartbreaking. So we are expanding to work on the other side of the border as well. There is lack of everything: water, food, contraceptives, democracy. So it's very hard to see. And now we are seeing a very concrete and aggressive move against civil society organizations. We already learned from one of our colleagues working on HIV, they have been shut down. The persecution of human rights defenders, particularly abortion care defenders. So we see a really difficult situation. Our partners there need all the support. They not only care for women, they care for women who care. Our partner PlaFam there provides food, provides school supplies for the children of their workers. They need to make sure they can access water and electricity, because that's not a given in the country. So the situation is really, it's a truly humanitarian situation, and we are prepared to continue supporting, because we don't believe it's going to get better, most unfortunately.
All right, I think we're going to shift now. We're a little bit behind time to our next session on labor. Giselle, I want to thank you so much for your comments. I know you need to go. And Vern, I hope we can keep you on for another hour for the Q&A shortly. But we are going to transition to our next session on labor. And I'd like to introduce our next 2 speakers. We have first, let me find the bio here, Dr. Mary Jerry Kinjajui, who is a former researcher and lecturer at the Institute for Development Studies at the University of Nairobi. She holds a PhD from Fitzwilliam College, University of Nairobi, and a master's from Kenyatta University. She has wide experience in the study of women and their livelihoods, and she's published multiple articles and books on this topic. And she's also been very involved in gender activism in Kenya. And directly after Jerry, she's asked to be referred to as Jerry, we have our very own at Rutgers, Dr. Usaina Alidu, professor at Rutgers in the Department of African, Middle Eastern, and South Asian Languages and Literatures. And she's also in the graduate program in Comparative Lit. She received her master's from the Université Abdou Moumouni in the Republic of Niger, and also another MA in Applied Linguistics from Indiana University, where she received her PhD in theoretical linguistics. She is a theoretical linguist and focuses mostly on the study of women's orality and literary practices in African Muslim societies, African Muslim women's agency and gender justice, as well as African women's literatures, gendered discourses of identity, and the politics of cultural production in African Muslim societies. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Jerry, and you have 10 minutes.
My topic is on women in the informal economy and COVID-19, extents and lessons learned. Can we move to the next slide? And I'll begin by saying that COVID-19 has not spared anyone, but women are the most affected because of the existing structural injustices and inequalities. We find that in the neoliberal economy, Women are relegated secondary positions in terms of access to money, education, jobs, and opportunities. In my study of the informal economy, I found out that it is a continuation into the 21st century of economic activities that existed before colonization, and they have been perpetuated over and over, more people joining in until into the, and they are based on an indigenous logic of self-reliance, mutual aid, and resistance. And my argument is that these people are not on a livelihood book rehearsal. They actually live, and they are known for their resilience and survivalist nature, and rarely do they say die. In the absence of state and of the state and corporations that create jobs, individuals create their own jobs, they build their own houses, and grow their own food. So it is estimated that about 70% of women in sub-Saharan Africa work in the informal economy and peasant agriculture activities. And when COVID-19 hit, it found them in these activities, and it had a lot of negative effects on them. Next slide. One of the formidable effects is that individuals laid off from the formal sector jobs moved into the informal economy markets. They brought in their cars. They would pack a lot of food and move around the markets, villages, and estates to supply the food. So the market women were left with nobody to sell to. And this affected their income, and it affected the way they were doing jobs. Also, you note that the women, the children were in school. Now they were locked down and they were not going to school. So the women had to withdraw from the market and go to stay with the children at home. This was a double burden to the women. Effect on domestic workers. You find that women from low-income neighborhoods, they go to high-income neighborhoods to work as domestic workers, to wash clothes, to clean houses, and to take care of the children. But because of the COVID lockdowns, these women were not able to go to these jobs anymore. And again, the families fearing that these domestic workers will bring disease, they laid them off and they left them without job because they feared that these women are going to bring in disease to the families. So they asked them to stop working and they were left on their own without food. We also note that the COVID-19 affected women tailors and garment makers, especially those who specialized in making school uniforms. After schools were closed down, there was low demand for clothes, for school uniforms. So it meant that those women who were making clothes for school children were left without jobs. They had to lay off some of their workers, or they had to go back to the rural area. There are women who make tourist goods like beads, handbags, and sandals. These women were very much affected because international flights were halted and tourists were not coming into the country. Thus, the women who make beads, sandals, handbags had no places to sell them. They were left with no place to sell these goods, and they were affected their incomes, and they had to lose jobs. So they had either to go back to the rural area or rely on friends and relatives. Effects on peasant food production. Decreased demand of food due to falling incomes in urban centers. You find that with the COVID-19, many of the urban workers were laid off and they didn't have enough extra cash to spend. So you find that they had to sacrifice on food. And after sacrificing on food, it meant that the demand for food went down, and foods like bananas and passion fruits lacked markets. So you find that in a home, they have lots of bananas, but they have nowhere to take them. You find that they have lots of sweet potatoes and they have nowhere to take them because families are just relying on the bare minimum of food. Effects on hairdressers and makeup stylists. You find that the hair salons employ a lot of women on the job. But with the lockdown and people working from home, it meant that women were not going to have their hair dressed, to have pedicure and manicure or facial makeup. And this grossly affected the hairstylists and the salonists. I don't have the actual data because it is difficult to do field work during the pandemic because of the lockdown. But you find that many women who are hairstylists, they had no jobs because they could not go to make hair do. And even the people started describing corona hairstyle, corona styles of hairstyle where one just fixes their own hair. The other group that were affected were the commercial sex workers. They were not spared. Because of night curfews, the flow of customers for commercial sex workers were affected. And they were lamenting a lot on newspapers saying that the curfews are affecting the flow of customers. So how did the women react to the negative impacts? They have responded rapidly and hung in there. In our book on stories of COVID-19, we saw women who would report to the streets, still looking for domestic work. We saw women who would report as bartenders, as garment makers, going to the markets every day and hanging in there, hoping that someone will come by and they'll have. They also looked for alternatives to keep themselves and their children alive. Because they have to feed children, they have to look for alternatives, like some changed from selling sweet potatoes to selling green pepper or to selling what we call sukuma wiki, daily vegetables. Others have taken children to their rural homes. This is because in the town, it has become unbearable. So what they do is they take their children to their parents in the rural area. Then the others have continued to report to work, hoping that someone will pass by. They are not saying die. They have relied on past savings. They have been marketing goods through their networks. They have devised WhatsApp groups, and they are using these groups to sell their products. Next slide. What are the lessons? The lessons are there is the need to mainstream the spirit of women in everyday life practices. You find that the spirit of women is never saying die. So it is important to help them to mainstream this in everyday life practices. Solidarity and supporting each other is also another lesson that the women can offer. They combine self-help, mutual aid, and resistance to achieve their goal of sustaining life and livelihood. These women work in solidarity with each other. They don't destroy competitors. This is the kind of the caring economy that we need, where we don't destroy competitors, but work together in cooperation. Women in the informal economy provide evidence of what women of the economy is. The economic woman, like we have the economic man, is resilient, concerned about care and nurturing as her logic of doing business. She's left self-reliant and works in solidarity. She does not destroy competitors, but works with them. She saves and stores for the future. So in this case, what we can learn from the women in reaction to COVID-19 is that there is a woman of the economy, a woman who can be said to be the economic woman, who is self-reliant, resilient, and works in solidarity with others, and she does not destroy her competitors. She saves and stores for the future. Next slide. Adapting to new realities. On the 29th of March, I wrote to officials in one of the informal markets and asked them whether they could start making masks for COVID-19. And the response was good, because on the 9th of April, I received a text message telling me that they have started making masks and they sold them to the markets and hawkers and the public, and this influenced the whole of Nairobi. So informal economy can take up adapt to new realities. So, and the minister came to visit the small workshop in the informal market. The women informal economy logic of synthesizing lives and livelihoods could not have presented us with the choice of life versus economy. You find that people have been arguing, should we have life or economy? But death, pain, and discomfort from COVID-19 illness cannot be compared to the economy. The economy can be restored and revived. Just like we had the Marshall's Plan, all we needed was to see how we would save lives, because lives are important, and once lost, they are not. And that's why the women in the informal economy had to create a synthesis of going to the market at the same time taking care not to contract COVID-19. Thank you. So,
thank you so much, Jerry. Thank you so much for this firsthand account of what's happening, and the some of the hope in terms of the making the masks and the example that's set. And I look forward also to talking with you about your advocacy. But first, let's turn to Usaina Alidou from Rutgers for your presentation. Usaina, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Diana, for the introduction. And I want to thank Anu for inviting us to this dialogue. And I enjoy very much the panel before us. And Mary, thank you for, Professor Njeri, thank you for your time to participate in this important dialogue and for bringing the conversation on the Africa side from Kenya. I know it's very late, but you agreed to join us. We are very grateful to you and grateful to each one of you who are participating. Asante sana. And thank you to colleagues at Global for allowing us to have this additional dialogue. This is a part of the solidarity. The greatness about a place, what makes a beloved community is that we don't get tired in intervening, especially in terms of crisis, to expand the dialogue and hear from different perspectives. So in this case, we have heard more from, in the case of Professor Njeri, she's speaking from the urban side. I'm going to shift to what is happening in West Africa, especially in the Sahel region, to look at what does it mean to look at life of women in the context of the COVID pandemic, and also in the context of conflicts, in a context of ongoing war, right? So what happens to women who are, as one of the panelists, Giselle, mentioned, women on the move, women who have become stateless as a result of the conditions of marginality engendered by extractive industries presence, and also the type of conflict, armed conflict, because of competition over resource reduction of access to natural resources engendered by the presence of extractive industries. And so how does the labor of women and men get transformed in this context? And how are we to understand in countries that are highly impoverished, like the Sahel belt? Please, may I go? So the Sahel belt is those countries in the yellow, from the Atlantic, in fact, all the way to Djibouti, in the East Coast, in the Horn of Africa, like places like Ethiopia and Eritrea, areas that are have been in a war zone for the past several decades. And so it will be difficult to discuss the condition of women within COVID, within the context of COVID, and imagining post-COVID without taking into account what are the reality of women living in this kind of areas. So their conditions, especially the women from rural areas whose labors depend on agriculture, agricultural labor. The economy is defined by agriculture, pastoralism, and the exchange between the rural areas and the urban areas, trading. And what happens when there is a lockdown, when a state did not provide any kind of economic relief, and then to impose lockdown? In a country, in areas, countries where you have population displacement and a huge number of migrant and refugee population. So it's very important that we take into account of this economies tied to extractivism. It is important to spend time discussing the impact of extractivism in land degradations, because extractive economies extract not only the gendered labor, but in the process of extracting minerals, they also undermine access to natural resources such as water to local populations. So you can imagine in the time of COVID, where pastoralist populations, where women and men herding communities who need grazing areas, but their grazing areas first have been reduced, and then there is a conflict with farmers, both farmers, men and women, in conflict with herders, men and women, and then access to basic water. If COVID requires washing hands constantly, keeping a certain degree of hygiene that is tied to water, well, imagine the level of the amount of water that extractive industries suck from the soil, and that also denies the indigenous population from the rural areas to have access to that water that is very fundamental to their economy and the survival, and also the fight against COVID. So in addition to the tension of access to natural resources, because of this presence of other multinational corporations extracting the minerals such as uranium and gold, and polluting the environment, creating ecological problems like climate change, etc. You have displacement of population and refugee from other places other than the Sahel region. We have refugees who have been displaced by, for instance, the continuing the similar problems, and from other countries like Nigeria, you have Boko Haram, you have Cameroon dealing with extractive economies and conflict among populations, coming towards the Sahel in the move to young people trying to move towards transiting through the Sahel in search of corridors to land to Europe. But
Zaina, excuse me, you're at 7 minutes, and I know you still have a number of slides to get through.
Yes, I want to move to the next slide, please. Thank you, Yana. So I just want to, it's important that we have this background of what the economies look like and what COVID has done, and then women, the women's place within this context. We can go to the next slide, please. So next, please, because so this is the corridor where when we are talking about refugees, we have to talk about refugees, women and the migrant women in the context of COVID. These migrant women and refugees, most of the time are whether they are a citizen, once they're being displaced from their villages, they become a really vulnerable population within their own countries. So access to social protection through the local governments, which become their host countries, or the host communities, become almost absent. And there is a competition in terms of the kind of economic activities they can run. So the kind of activities that they run in terms of local women on the move is in the domestic sectors, is also giving their services very often in the mining industries. And this is where they encounter a high level of violence and high level of violence, gender-based violence, but also being underpaid and most of the time not being paid. Then you have refugee women who have not been registered officially by the UN, who are also, basically stateless women who do not have any social protection from the state, and who are in competition also with local women and men who are vulnerable population in the move, as Giselle mentioned in the case of Latin America. Could we go, please? We can go again, we can keep going. So how does the question of labor for women from rural areas who are pastoralists, or farmers, peasant women, in the time of when COVID break out, the government announced lockdown. And so imagine when peasant women cannot sell their produce in the markets. Mobility is very fundamental for women from rural areas to the local market, seasonal market. When the lockdown happened and then there is no access to any relief to support their families, they had to convert into other type of jobs. And confrontation with the police, confrontation with the state, but they continue through their own modes of self-organizing in communities to recreate themselves as new laborers. And the areas of labor that they have occupied are in the nearby towns and cities where they become domestic servants, most of them. And because being domestic servant, if you are considered foreigner in the space, the type of protection, security protection that you are supposed to acquire from the state is not guaranteed in terms of your protection of your human rights, protection of what happens if the employer violates you at different level. We have noticed with my research assistant, we are conducting research to look at the amount of violation of rights sexual violation, violation of remuneration, and violation of the right to be mobile within one's own country. And then you have other refugee women who are violated even though they are part of the ECOWAS, which is the economic communities of West Africa, which technically does not make them foreigners in that space called Niger or Mali, because they're holders of passports from ECOWAS countries. However, because of the context of crisis and the COVID, they become very vulnerable in a point where they cannot even exercise any jobs. So these are the kind of the kind of situation where this the question of work for women in context of war and in context of displacement, in context of becoming stateless, and becomes very problematic when we talk about women's work, because there are situations where women cannot work. So what happened is the form of solidarity that we experience in other countries, like in the context that in the urban settings, women organize themselves. Women who are stateless, who are made vulnerable, who are not registered officially as refugees, do not receive any type of opportunities for economic activities. And this has created a lot of impoverishment for women. And so in terms of ILO and UN labor policies, I think it's very important that we try to consider what happened to women in context of war, in context of displacement, in context of statelessness, where they cannot exercise work, where they cannot benefit even if they're working, because they're in condition of statelessness. And I want to leave it right there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Husseina. That was a fantastic presentation, an important background. I agree with you. We need to know about that migration, and it looks like women on the move is becoming one of the key themes of today's session. We are unfortunately out of time for Q&A on this segment. So for members of our audience, I will ask you to hold your questions until the very end. So now I'm going to pass the baton to our wonderful Rebecca Mark, Director of the Institute for Women's Leadership at Rutgers. Rebecca, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Yana. This has been a fascinating discussion so far, and I hope we'll be able to have a question and answer period at the end. It is my great honor to be a moderator for this panel on violence against women and girls. Our first speaker today is Alexandra Robinson, Gender-Based Violence Advisor for the United Nations Population Fund. Alexandra Robinson has worked with the United Nations and for the last decade with the UNFPA in the areas of child protection, gender-based violence, gender and human rights. This includes most recently with UNFPA in Myanmar and the Pacific region. Her work has taken her across humanitarian, peace building, and development settings across North Africa, as well as South Asia. She has now recently taken up a position as the Global GBV Advisor for UNFPA headquarters in the Gender and Human Rights branch. She has a much longer bio, but for the sake of letting her have her full time, I will turn it over to Alexandra.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. So I just wanted to first off say I'm absolutely delighted to be part of the panel today. It's wonderful to be part of such a wealth of wonderful women working to end gender inequality, and in my case and many others to work to end gender-based violence. So it's a deep privilege for me to be part of such a great group of women. So I thought I'd start just by setting the scene and speaking about where is it that we're at now? And, you know, many of us may already be aware of a report that was released in the last few weeks with the support of, or a UN statistical report that with the support of Young Women and WHO was released recently, which did some modelling on the estimates of the prevalence of gender-based violence, and more specifically, in fact, violence against women. And what we know is that, or what we estimate is that almost 1 in 3 have been subjected to intimate partner violence, non-partner sexual violence, or both at least once in their lifetime, which is significant. And of those who've been in a relationship, almost 1 in 4 adolescent girls have experienced from an intimate partner, which is hugely concerning, given that not only is the violence started early in their lifetime, but has impacts which extend beyond that relationship and throughout their life course. So I will share the links to this in the chat as well, so that people can have a closer look at it. But UNFPA have also released a geospatial dashboard on intimate partner violence, and what this dashboard can do is tell us for any particular or can provide reliable and comparable data on violence against women in any of those highlighted countries. And I think we're covering 119 countries here. It includes subnational data, so we can start to understand variables between regions within a country. As many know, you know, trying to say that IPV in one country is indicative of all the different areas doesn't provide quite the evidence base we need for effective program or advocacy interventions. It's also disaggregated by age, place of residence, employment, education, and household wealth. So it does provide a really in-depth analysis of the data. This slide here is once you're into the dashboard, and you can see here the way that the data is broken down by country and by sub-region. And as I said before, I will share that link in the chat box for people to look at. The data can be extracted to help also support more in-depth analysis for any given particular reason. So now if I turn to the impacts of COVID-19 on GBV specifically, so UNFPA programming GBV response and prevention programs in over 105 countries globally, over half of which are humanitarian settings. Now, with the COVID-19, every single country in which UNFPA program has now turned into a humanitarian crisis. And I think that could be said equally for any organisation currently working in countries affected by COVID-19. When the pandemic started, UNFPA, Avenir Health, Johns Hopkins University and Victoria University assessed the projected impact of the pandemic on gender-based violence, and the research or the methodology estimated that there would be an increase of 15 million new cases of gender-based violence reported for every 3 months of lockdown, which is significant, and which is why we started to talk about GBV as a shadow pandemic. Furthermore, the pandemic's hindered efforts and programs to prevent other types of harmful practices against women and girls. So at the same time, it was estimated, for example, that 2 million cases of female genital mutilation, 13 million cases of child marriage would occur as a direct result of the pandemic. And we're currently also doing research to understand the impact of the pandemic on son preference and gender-biased sex selection, which we suspect or predict will also be set to increase as poverty spirals. So in the slide here, a few key points are that we know that COVID-19 is exacerbating pre-existing gender-based violence. So while we have all the dashboards and that tell us exactly what the rates of intimate partner or the prevalence of intimate partner violence are in different countries and sub-regions, we can expect those to have increased. We know that restricted movement, reduction in community interaction, closure of services, all limit survivors' ability to distance themselves from perpetrators and reduce their ability to access services. And in most cases, for these same reasons, GBV will remain unreported due to a lack of availability of safe and effective response services, as well as fear of stigmatisation or reprisal in certain contexts, and sometimes also a lack of access to appropriate information on seeking help. And finally, the crisis is likely to have a long-term negative consequence on women's health and well-being, safety and security, economic empowerment, and participation, as we've heard from other speakers as well. We do know that there have been a number of studies recently which have been assessing the risk factors of GBV during COVID, and they do indicate that some of those include whether they are married or unmarried, whether they're employed or unemployed, and also in relation to household food insecurity and spousal substance abuse. All of these things are contributing to increased incidence of GBV. Protective factors, however, which have been identified include higher education levels of either the survivor or the perpetrator, as well as women's employment. Okay. So the next slide, what I will talk about is largely around data collection during COVID-19. And, there was at the beginning of the pandemic, a really strong push to start to understand exactly what the increases in incidence of violence were. And, a lot of work was done to start to provide some safe and ethical guidelines around the collection of data during COVID-19 for a range of reasons, including the fact that women are often at home with their perpetrators raised, and response services may not be available in the same way they would be otherwise. There was a lot of work done to make sure that we could think and provide approaches that would ensure the safety of women during any kind of data collection and research. But what we do know, I guess, is that, looking back over the last 12 months, the collation of all the research that we have, any small-scale prevalence work and administrative data are telling us that the original estimates were in fact on track. But it is difficult to quantify any increase in GBV data. Any increase in just GBV for a couple of reasons. First of all, is that prevalence data really isn't recommended. And secondly, a reliance on administrative data, and by that I mean women who actually report cases of violence to seek support services, can measure trends and can provide an analysis of trends, but that data, again, only relies on women who have access to services to report, but also is very context specific. So it will depend on the availability of services in any given place. It will depend on women's access to mobile phones, for example, or how they feel about accessing any health services or social services. Now, the reason why we don't support collection of large-scale prevalence data during pandemics or during this pandemic is that women's safety really, as I've said, really does need to be prioritised over data collection. We don't want to expose women to further harm in collecting the data. While some small-scale prevalence surveys have been undertaken, they will only be able to provide us with point-in-time data and generally can't be generalised to larger populations. So if we do a small-scale survey in one suburb in a city, we can't necessarily generalise that to the entire area. However, survey data can capture a greater range of experiences, and not only those which are the most severe or where help-seeking behaviour occurs. And as I said, the administrative data we generally would only report on administrative data in terms of trends and not specific numbers. And again, it's influenced by movement restrictions, a level of capacity of existing services to reach women, availability of online services and lifelines or hotlines, and that access to digital technology, including mobile phones. However, this high demand for data did lead to some work by UNFPA and UN Women and a program, Novel Data Initiative, in the development of a decision tree around how to collect data, when to collect data, and has provided a way in which researchers can make decisions around what type of data collection that they can do. And given all of this, there has been a stronger drive towards or a increasing use of big data. And we've seen that in East and Southern Africa, and we also saw that in the Asia region. So here I've just highlighted some really some data snapshots, I guess. Although while I can't speak to global trends, we can highlight some of the research that has been undertaken or reports that have been made and are made public. So when I speak to big data, really, the report in Asia of UNFPA and UN Women, we saw that 8 countries in the Asia region, internet searches related to violence against women and help-seeking behaviour increased by up to 70%, and that specifically was in Malaysia. Again, links to all of these reports I can provide through the chat or through Anu. In East and Southern Africa, there was also some work on big data, and we saw that between 45% of women in Mozambique and almost 80% of women in Uganda believed the incidence of GBV had increased. Latin America and the Caribbean, we saw a 70% increase of help-seeking behaviour in El Salvador, 65% increase of femicides in Mexico, and that is combined with a severe lack of services which have been available to women, which suggests a critical situation in that part of the world. In the Arab states, there's been an overall increase in reporting, and we've seen this up to 69% between March and April last year in Palestine, and that's with a particular service provider supported by the International Rescue Committee. The GBV information management system in Lebanon is also reporting increase in support seeking for GBV responses. Across the Pacific, we've also seen increased levels of use of hotlines and helplines, particularly in Tonga, where we registered a 54% increase. Yeah, if we look at some of the next steps here, I think, most of these next steps are not things that are new, but things that we're becoming more and more aware of and things that are becoming more and more critical in the work that we do. And it's been really wonderful to hear from other speakers that feminist focus of how we approach our work. And I think that's becoming increasingly critical. And that really starts with involving women and girls in everything that we do, participatory approaches in preparedness and response plans from a local level right through to your national, regional and global levels. And that's not just about making space for women at the table, but about substantive contributions and really understanding what it is that women and girls need in that process of preparedness. And I think here we also really start to see that space where humanitarian responses and normal development programming really intersect. Here again, and building on that, looking at really reinforcing national and local actors and women's-led organisations. What do their movements look like, and how do we best support them in meeting the needs of women and girls? Looking at, and I say this in localizing everything that we do is critical. Having really great global guidelines or even regional guidelines is always wonderful and always a great tool, but it's not going to mean very much if we don't have the engagement of women on the ground and organisations on the ground who really understand the context in which they're being implemented. Boosting public awareness and outreach. What is it that we do around social movements? Who are our influencers, and how do we start to really support those movements in a constructive way? Investment in innovative mechanisms for reporting. We've seen an incredible increase in the way, in the way that organisations, women's-led organisations, GBV service providers have reached out to make sure that women and girls can access GBV support services. And I think this is a key point in time where we take that opportunity and we harness all that innovation and start to drive forward an agenda around innovation and that investment in those mechanisms, which has been absolutely critical. Ensuring adequate housing and shelter options. So we know that, so many times during this pandemic, we've had survivors who are living with their perpetrators. How do we extract them? How do we provide women with housing that they want or need? How do we make sure that we put women or support women into housing and alternative options which don't cut them off from their social networks? How do we do that in a way that's safe and actually is responsive to what women need and want, or what survivors need and want? And that would also include, I think, starting to look at much more substantive partnerships with the private sector.
Alexandra, I think we're going to have to wrap up a little bit because we've got another.
No problem.
No, and it's just
this is my last slide.
Okay.
So I can say this very, very quickly, I think, but I've got a few things here around ensuring adequate health sector responses and law enforcement and judicial interventions. They are key, and social services, they are key sectors of response for GBV. Making sure that they're accessible, quality, safe and ethical continues to be part of the work that we do. And as I said before, making sure that we can capitalise on innovative ways of delivering those services and interventions is critical. I also just wanted to say that in our ongoing response and prevention programming, making sure that we still maintain monitoring and evaluation efforts, and making sure that we are in fact tracking those innovations and good practices, that we're capturing the evidence of the efficacy of those interventions and responses and looking at how we can adapt those for longer term programming. Thanks, Rebecca. Sorry.
That's all right. We have one more speaker and we want some time for Q&A. So I am so honored to present Dr. Rebecca Zhu, an assistant professor in the Department of Economics at Howard University, Washington, D.C. Her research concentrates on topics of household economics, intimate partner violence, and economics of crime. She is also working on projects of the COVID-19 and crime, such as the impact of unemployment insurance and staying at home on crime. She has published her research in journals such as Economic Inquiry, Review of Economics of the Household, Feminist Economics, Journal of Family and Economic Issues, among others. Welcome, Dr. Zhu.
Hi, thank you, Rebecca, for the introduction. And I want to thank Jana for inviting me to this rather global event. It's an honor to be here. So today I'm going to present my research with Dr. Alexander Henke on COVID-19, staying at home, and domestic violence. Okay, so here. So domestic violence is a global issue. It's not just a global South or a developing country issue. About 1 in 3 Americans experience domestic violence in their lifetime based on CDC reports. And since 2020 March, some state government and some local city government, they start to mandate this shelter-in-place order. And this order coincided with sharp changes in individuals' mobility. So there are 2 key effects that are related to our research. The first one is that the staying-at-home order increased unemployment. And the second effect is that the shelter-in-place order kind of force like the abuser and the victim to stay in the confined area. There are several economic theories of domestic violence can be applied in here. The first one is exposure reduction theory, and the second one is economic bargaining power. So economic bargaining power basically is saying that when women's labor market opportunity improved, she has more ability to leave the abusive relationship. So you will expect the domestic violence to decrease. And during the pandemic, if the woman's unemployment increases, especially compared to male unemployment, then you will expect the domestic violence to increase because women, they lack resources to leave the abusive relationship. And the second economic theory of domestic violence, exposure reduction theory, which is what we focus on today, is basically saying that when the abuser and the victim spend more time together, then you will expect the domestic violence to increase. So these different economic theories lead to different policy recommendation questions. So one example of the policy questions for exposure reduction theory is that, do we need to invest in more physical spaces for domestic violence victims? Kind of like what Alexandra was talking about, expanding the housing and shelter options as the next step. So the highlights of our finding is that we find that staying at home increased domestic violence reports by about 5% in 35 US major cities from mid-March to near the end of May in 2020. So here I'm gonna go over the data that we use. So like Alexandra mentioned, data collection is a big issue. So fortunately in the US, we are able to access the daily up-to-date open police data sets that identify domestic violence. So we collect from 35 major cities in the US. So this is an example, LAPD. You can go to this website and then find out the calls for service data in 2020. And this is what the data looks like. The first column shows you the date, and then the last column shows you the description of the calls. So we focus on, when we talk about domestic violence, we specifically focus on intimate partner violence, so we look for keywords like domestic assault, domestic battery. We exclude child abuse, child neglect, or sexual violence. So the second key data that we use is mobile device tracking data from SafeGraph Data Consortium. So SafeGraph collects millions and millions of cell phone data in the US. So it tracks where you go, how long do you spend in the shop, and then how long you've been away from home. This is an example of what you can do with SafeGraph data. Is that this is show you a shelter-in-place index by different cities in different regions. One very common way to study the domestic violence and COVID-19 is use the difference in different studies. Lesson and Wilson, in their paper published on Journal of Public Economic Papers, they defined the pandemic event as the day individuals began to stay at home. So not necessarily the day that the cities initiate the stay-at-home order. So they attribute the differences in domestic violence trend between 2019 to 2020 to the pandemic. It's a strong identification strategy. However, it tells you that pandemic increased domestic violence, but it doesn't really tell you why the pandemic increased domestic violence. So on the right-hand side, you can see this figure. This is an event study coefficient plot from one of our working paper, that you can see the effect of pandemic on domestic violence. is really strong, especially in the first few months. But then this effect kind of like goes away maybe after 3 months, right? And this is partly because like people start to relax and they stop staying at home. So instead of using the different insurance methodology, we measure the degrees of staying at home directly using the cell phone tracking data that I mentioned before. So on this graph, you could see that it shows you like two trends. The blue line shows you domestic violence per capita, and the red line shows you the average fraction of people stay home all day. So you can see like both trends kind of like coincide together. The vertical dot line shows you the first day in our sample, the city started to implement the shelter-in-place order. And you can also see that people, they do started to stay at home much earlier before then the shelter-in-place order. So the benefit of using this methodology as opposed to the difference in difference is that we can answer policy relevant questions directly. So especially in here, we control for like the degree of people staying at home in different cities. You can answer questions about exposure reduction theory. So in conclusion, we find that staying at home due to the pandemic increased domestic violence by 5% in the US since like mid-March to end of May in 2020. And our results are very likely to be conservative because of the systematic underreporting of abuse to police. So in general, economic opportunity can give women the power to leave abusive relationship, but labor market is not a silver bullet during the pandemic, especially during the pandemic. Like we talk about the exposure reduction theory, being able to get away from your abuser might be is also very important. So that's my talk. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And I think Yana and I can join together for a quick question and answer period, and that anybody has questions can put them in the chat, or you could actually, well, if you send them in the chat, we will ask them. So.
Yes, okay. I think if people unmute themselves and
yes, that's fine with me if they unmute themselves and ask the question. So,
I actually had a question for Jerry. I read your bio and said you do quite a bit of gender advocacy. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more specifically about your advocacy work and what you've been doing during the pandemic. I know we don't have much time, so if you can maybe summarize briefly your advocacy work during the pandemic.
My advocacy work during the pandemic has been done through WhatsApp, talking to different women, encouraging them to continue production, calling my research subjects whom I'm in contact with, and talking to them, telling them about how they can adjust and how they can survive in business. I've been telling them about using, taking photographs like of tomatoes, potatoes, and posting them to their clients. I've been encouraging them to start taking videos of themselves at the market, those who have smartphones. And I'm advocating for people to try as much as they can to get smartphones and digitize skills. For example, digitize the skills of making the beadwork so that they can easily transfer to those who are learning. I'm involved through WhatsApp groups, through telephone calls, and all that. That's the kind of thing that I've been doing with my research subjects because of the lockdowns.
Thank you, Jerry. And Luna, I see, has a hand up. Luna?
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Rogers. Actually, There was a question posed in the chat regarding GBV in Brazil. So I would just briefly mention that even before the pandemic, the data from 2018 showed that every 2 hours, a woman died in Brazil as a victim of femicide. And in the past 2 years, so from 2018 to 2020, this situation only changed and improved for non-Black women. So even before the pandemic, we were already in a state of lack of protection for women and girls. And the COVID-19 pandemic made the situation much worse. And I think Giselle and other panelists mentioned that this, of course, is caused by a lack of gender lens in the response to crisis. And this in Brazil is paired to the fact that we have a government that is openly opposed to talking about gender inequality. And this has practical effects on the implementation of the laws, which range from reducing public investments and policies to combat violence and to weaken fundamental social policies for the survival of women in poverty and extreme poverty. And actually, in 2019, we had like the lowest investment in service provision for GBV in Brazil. So this is just one example of how the other panelists said that the lack of gender lens, particularly during emergencies, put women and girls at the center of emergencies as caregivers, but did not put their rights and needs at the center as well. And one of our partners from the civil society presented a response to that, ANIS, Instituto of Bioética. They created a WhatsApp channel as well to do some sort of advocacy through WhatsApp and answer questions and refer women to services, including GBV in Brazil.
I just wanted to follow up on the fact that when we talk about crises and the COVID crises, I went through Katrina, and I can say that the numbers of the people who died in the storm and the number of people who died from COVID, I wanted to know from all our speakers, is there data collection about women who died from not having enough to eat, from domestic violence, from femicide, so that we have this secondary, we've been talking about the double crisis, but I wonder if those numbers are being linked, because we found that the people who actually died in the flood, there were many, many women who died in the following 6 to 8 months.
Rebecca, maybe to say, that the experience of UNFPA during humanitarian crisis is certainly that there are some statistics across the, particularly in the Asia Pacific region, which I think is one of the most disaster-prone areas in the world, that the mortality of women is something like 80% higher. But don't quote me on that. I'd have to actually go back and check the research, but it's certainly much, much higher, and for a range of different reasons, which would include things like women having, generally being the primary carers, looking after their families, children, means that they're the last to leave, or, certainly during the tsunami in gosh, I'm trying to think of the year or which decade it was now, but, during the tsunami across this region, many countries such as Bangladesh, for example, women don't swim. So there are, increases in drowning of women. So there are a range of reasons, but certainly women are much more affected by humanitarian responses. And that is in addition to the increasing levels of gender-based violence and femicide.
I think we will turn the mic back to Anu, and thank you for an exceptional organizing conference. It's been wonderful, and I let you make the final comments here.
I think I'm actually going to turn it over to my boss, Rick Garfunkel, to say some final remarks, but I do want to thank everyone. Thank you, Jana and Rebecca, And thank you to all the presenters for incredible presentations. I wish we had more time. We could easily use another hour, I think. And thank you for all the people, all the attendees. But I'll turn this over to Rick Garfunkel.
Thank you all very much for the session. It was very informative. I learned quite a few new things, somewhat out of my specialty. What to do? I mean, it's hard to get good metrics on some of these, good numbers on some of these, and I know everyone is trying real hard. I think it's important that everyone continue to try to get useful numbers. Independent of that, the advocacy, at least in Washington, probably works much better than 6 months ago. So some movement can be made there, and then those people can move internationally on the advocacy that needs to be, very much needs to be pushed forward on this. I'm not quite sure who you work with in Washington, but I'm sure there are multiple groups, and you know who to reach out to more that can address these issues. I mean, the COVID and vaccine nationalism and sort of COVID nationalism was a problem for the past year, and that has to be addressed. And this has to be obviously one key issue that's addressed in parallel with that. Again, I'm not quite sure how and how much pressure is being done, because right now the big fight is being done over, you know, who has the vaccines and where and how are they distributed. And this probably, as usual, takes you know, comes in second or third on the list of priority items. In any case, very informative for me. And Anu, you will post this to all recipients, the recording of this, so they can have access to that? Yes. I think that would be useful. And a lot of people I know who couldn't make it or had to jump off halfway through, I think would like to have access to this. Again, thank you all for joining, and I'll stay on afterwards if anyone else has any questions, sort of regular Rutgers Global questions. Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.
Participants, and thank you, Anu, for organizing this.